So, good afternoon to everyone. We are very pleased to introduce this webinar with Marialaura Bonaccio. Dr. Bonaccio is an epidemiologist and public health researcher at the Department of Epidemiology and Prevention of the Istituto Neurological Mediterraneo, NEUROMED. She received her PhD degree in epidemiology from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands in 2015, and her main interest relates to socioeconomic determinants of health and lifestyle, with particular focus on diets and the Mediterranean diet, especially. She is also the author of a book entitled La dieta mediterranea ai tempi della crisi, published with Il Pensiero Scientifico in 2014. Dr. Bonaccio is the author of numerous publications in leading scientific journals, including The Lancet, British Medical Journal, and other public health journals. And she received an award from the Fondazione Umberto Veronesi for a study she conducted a few years ago. In 2023, she also published a study on ultra-processed food consumption and the association with some health outcomes, including diabetes type 2. And she's also one of the co-authors of a publication that we quoted during the course entitled Diet Quality and Risk of SARS-CoV-2 Infection or COVID-19, which is a systematic review of observational studies on the impact of healthy diets on hospitalizations for COVID, mortality, but also infection. And this is very peculiar. And we will have some questions about these relationships. So without any further ado, I will allow Dr. Bonaccio to start her presentation, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. Some of my questions and questions from you can prepare from now. So we are very pleased to have you, Marialaura. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Professor De Vogli, first of all, for inviting me for this webinar. I know that you're interested in food and pandemics relationships, so I prepared, quick slides just to share with you and your students our work that was basically conducted during the pandemic years. Basically, our main research question at that time, but it is still, let's say, very timely question, is whether diet could be related to the risk of getting infected or to develop the COVID disease. We know that this problem has been a dominant public health issue during the past years. And at that time, we knew that some factors could be associated with an increased risk of getting the infection or developing the disease. Basically, we knew that there were some pre-existing medical conditions, for example, being obese or having diabetes, cardiovascular disease, but also impaired renal function that could play a role in the risk of infection. But there was poor knowledge on let's say, the role of diet in preventing the infection. So our attention was focused on understanding how diet could be related to the onset of the disease or to the infection. We just, to share with you this knowledge is we have a very large population-based cohort study here in Italy, which is possibly one of the largest cohorts in Europe, which is called Molisani because we are in Molise, which is a small southern Italian region. And from 2005 till 2010, we recruited like 25,000 people who were residing in this region. And these people have been following up, every 2 years for major chronic disease. So this served as a basis for our studies on COVID, because during the pandemic, we were able to recruit like 1,500 persons, with all the procedures, safety procedure, etc. But we were able to recruit these people to understand if they were got in contact with the virus. So basically, this is, the description of our study population from where the data stem out. And we had this large cohort in 2005, 2010. Then just before the pandemic outbreak, we could recruit like 2,581 people. And then we had a recall of a small part of these people just for a focus on COVID studies. So basically we knew how these people used to eat just before the COVID outbreak. And this allows us to understand the role of habitual diet in relation to the risk of getting infected or developing the disease. At that time, it was, a little bit difficult to understand which participants got in contact with the virus. So we developed, let's say, a new laboratory test to divide people, because we had, 0.5% of participants did not receive the vaccine at that time. But they could be in contact with the virus. So we used a specific laboratory test to understand if the contact with the virus was from the vaccine, let's say, if they were vaccinated because they developed the spike, or if they were just in contact with or without symptoms of the disease. Anyway, this is very technical stuff, but at the end, we could identify a number of participants. Let's say we found 120 participants who developed who were in contact with the disease. Some of them were just infected, others developed the COVID-19 disease. Our exposure was, the traditional Mediterranean diet, and I guess that everybody knows which is, but is well represented in this pyramid, where you can see, the graphical representation of the Mediterranean diet. And basically what we did was to associate the habitual diet of this participant with their risk of developing infection, of getting infected. And you can see on the left side of the screen the association with the risk of infection. And we found that, for example, an increase in the consumption of the cereal group was associated with about 10% lower risk of being infected. But when we look at the risk of having the disease, that for us was like opposing the infected versus those who reported symptoms. For us was, this was our way of defining the disease. We found that the association of the Mediterranean diet overall tended to be associated with the lower risk of the disease. You can see here about 18% lower risk. And when we analyzed its individual components, we found that the foods that were more likely to drive this association were fruits and nuts. So basically, if you increase the consumption of this food group, you experience like 10% lower risk of getting ill with COVID. And also, we found a protective role of olive oil. The confidence interval, of course, are quite large because of the small sample. But at that time was one of the very first population-based cohort studies. So let's say it was quite novel, this observation. And also we saw an association for moderate alcohol consumption that in our population is basically reflects wine consumption, because we are a Mediterranean countries. And in this population, Molisani, most of the ethanol intake comes from red wine consumption. So basically, we identified 3 major food groups that were associated with lower risk of COVID. Just to sum up, there was fruit and nuts, olive oil, and red wine. Of course, one asks where there is biological plausibility to the observation. At that time, but still today, the hypothesis is that COVID has been defined as a cytokine storm. I mean, this disease, when you get in contact, can cause a very high inflammation in your body. And if you see, all these groups that were found associated with reduced risk of the disease are all well known for their anti-inflammatory properties. We know that olive oil is full of antioxidants and polyphenols and antioxidants in general have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. The same is true for wine, especially red wine, because, you know, ethanol has an antithrombotic effect, and combined with the polyphenol part of wine, this combination can be very useful to lower inflammation. And the same is true also for all vegetable stuff, like, you know, fruit and nuts and cereals, and was exactly the food that we found associated with lower risk of infection and of developing the disease. Then when the number of studies reached a good number, let's say, we could conduct a systematic review of the evidence about diet and risk of SARS-CoV infection or COVID disease. And this was published last year. And basically, we were able to include like 13 observational studies. Of these, 7 were prospective. And you know that prospective studies are, you know, provide much strong evidence compared to, for example, cross-sectional studies. We included 3 cross-sectional studies and 3 case control studies. Overall, the finding of this systematic review were consistent in showing, in saying that nutrition diets could lower the risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection and of the disease. And when we looked at studies that, like we did, analyzed the individual components of these larger dietary patterns, we found that the foods that were most likely to drive this association were the same that we observed in our core study, that is fruits, vegetables, and sources of fiber. So basically, the key message from these 2 studies that I quickly discuss with you is that an habitual diet that was rich in some key components typical of a Mediterranean diet, like, you know, olive oil, wine, cereals, fruit and nuts, could be effective in reducing the risk of infection or disease, in this case, COVID disease. Of course, this is let's say, is plausible from a biological point of view, because as we see, most of these foods have strong anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. But there is another side of the nutrition. When we talk about nutrition, we've been always look at food from their nutritional composition. I mean, a good nutrition is made of foods that are sources of fiber, vitamins, and are low, for example, in bad fats like saturated, trans, and so on. But in the last years, this way of looking at food and at diet as a whole has been largely questioned, because it has been proposed that the nutritional composition alone cannot fully explain the overall potential of food. So basically, it has been proposed to look at the extent food are processed, and not looking anymore at the components, the nutritional composition of these foods. This is for people involved in nutritional epidemiology and in nutrition studies is like a great revolution in the nutrition health relationship studies. Because basically, according to this new way of looking at food, you can have these 4 different categories where you find in the same group, for example, the group 1, this is the NOVA classification, which has been proposed 15 years ago by Brazilian researchers. And according to this new scheme, you can find in the same group meat and fruits together with milk and fish. So this is like, absolutely unconceivable from a traditional nutritional point of view. But this classification is not interested in classifying food just because they are, they provide some key nutrients, but just because, for example, red meat, fresh red meat, is basically the same stuff of having fresh fruit because it's not being processed. So, it includes foods that are not largely processed. And also fresh red meat is not processed, like, for example, processed meat, like, salami and ham and so on. So basically, this classification groups food according to an increasing level of processing. The category that in the last years raised some concern for health is the group 4, which includes ultra-processed food. Ultra-processed food are basically everywhere, and the consumption is on the rise globally. Just to let you know that in the US and UK, over 60% of daily calories come from these foods, while in Italy we estimated a percentage less than 20%. So it's like 1/3 compared to people living in US. But this is just estimation that are 10 years ago. Now the things, of course, are possibly worse in terms of consumption. So this is something that relates closely also to our country. These foods, as I said before, include not just junk food. When you talk about ultra-processed food, you don't have to limit the inclusion of foods like, fast food, junk food, because in this category, you can find also foods that are nutritionally balanced. For example, let's consider the example of bread, supermarket bread. It could be also a good option in terms of nutritional composition, because it might be made with high fiber flours, so it could be a valuable source of fiber. It could contain a low amount of fat and so on. But this bread is still highly processed, heavily processed. And even if its composition could be acceptable from, a traditional nutritional approach, for the NOVA classification, this food has had too much processing. So this is like, is put in this category of UPF. Also, for example, breakfast cereals are considered, most of them are UPF, or for example, flavored yogurt, those with low fat content, low sugar content, everything that is low in something is most likely to be an UPF. And these are the results of a very recent meta-analysis, which basically put together all the studies that have been published until, let's say, the beginning of this year, and basically summarized the effect of UPF against several diseases, like, for example, CVD mortality or type 2 diabetes. But if you can see, we have an association also with mental health outcomes like depression and anxiety. So what happened to UPF during COVID? Of course, there have been groups that analyzed UPF. We analyzed the protective factor like the Mediterranean diet, but other groups focused on less risk factors because they assumed that a diet rich in this food, which are also pro-inflammatory food. I mean, if you assume that COVID is able to produce a cytokine storm in your body, of course, a diet which is pro-inflammatory is potentially linked to an increased inflammation in your body. These are the results of the UK Biobank, in UK, of course, and they analyzed the habitual consumption of UPF in this population and found an increased risk of 22% for those who consume a very high amount of these foods compared to those consuming lower. Also, in our group, we analyzed how this consumption was changed during the COVID pandemic, because we all know that dietary habits, dietary consumption during the pandemic were deeply changed during these days that we stay at home more than ever. And we found, for example, that about 37% of our participants in the Molisani study reported to a mild to high increase in the consumption of these foods. In particular, people reported to consume more chocolate, biscuits, and pizza as compared to the years before pandemic, but also some diet-related behaviors changed during pandemic, like, for example, the number of daily meals, and also the use of short supply chain compared to supermarket because, you know, of the risk of infection in large place, crowded place. And finally, we have also investigated whether the psychological distress experienced during the confinement in those years in Italy was somehow related to changes in Italy. And for this, we used the Molisani data, but also the data from a web-based survey that was like Alt Risk COVID was the name, that we launched in that month, and was a convenient sample, of course, but was useful to compare these results with the one from the Molisani study. And what we did was to put in relation the changes in adherence to the Mediterranean diet and the changes in consumption of UPF with several domains of mental health. We used the PHQ-9, which basically addressed the depressive symptoms, also a scale measuring anxiety symptoms, and also the perceived stress, and two subscale of a larger score, which basically measured the psychological distress. And we found significant association between change in adherence to the Mediterranean diet. I mean, the more you increased during the pandemic to a Mediterranean dietary pattern, the lower was the values of this scale, of the psychological distress scale, for the depressive symptoms included in this scale, while the opposite was observed for a change in ultra-processed food consumption. The more you have at that time consumption of UPF, the higher the value of this scale, reflecting an increasing depressive symptoms. And this was true both in the Molisani cohort and in the alter-risk COVID survey, that was this web-based survey. So at the end of these two studies, we could provide evidence that psychological distress experienced during confinement was associated with unhealthy dietary modification, because, of course, we observed an increase in the UPF consumption and a decrease in the Mediterranean diet adherence. And of course, these results, both the first one on the diet and risk of disease and infection, and this one on psychological distress and consequent dietary changes, of course, could be useful for future pandemics. Let's hope that we have to face soon another one. But of course, now we have a more clear picture of what can be done at individual level, but also at political level, both to reduce the risk of infection, but also to counteract the impact of the stress on health. So basically, I hope that I did not take too much time for discussion, and this is my last slide. This is my group working in Pozzilli. As you can see, we work with olive trees, surrounded by olive trees, and I wish to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marialaura. That was a lovely presentation, very punchy, solid, and short, and very clear as well. So thanks for this presentation. I would like to start asking you whether in your model or in your results actually showing that the lockdown had an impact both on increase of ultra-processed food consumption. I think you mentioned biscuits, chocolate, and pizza, right? Pizza, yeah. Students are very careful here, they remember these things. Plus, you show that there were some levels of stress that increased in the population during the lockdown. Do you think that there were also some socioeconomic categories that were more affected, and lockdown have affected some groups more than others? Have you been able to discern these effects? Because we heard during the pandemic that the virus was a democratic virus affecting everyone, including the rich and powerful. Yet the evidence on socioeconomic factors and COVID show very clearly that COVID-19 had a much worse impact on people of lower socioeconomic categories. Can you explain a bit this?
Yes, we did not address directly this potential socioeconomic gradient in the impact of the stress on habits. But anyway, there are lots of studies that indicate that the pandemic had an impact on mental health in a different way in the more vulnerable groups. And what we mean with this term is like, people with low education or people with reduced financial resources. But in this sense, this is not new because everything affects population group differently. For example, we used to say that the low educational status kills more people than cholesterol, because healthy behaviors are disproportionately distributed across socioeconomic status. For example, we know one of the first studies that we performed in our Molisani study was to analyze, for example, the adherence to the Mediterranean diet with the household income. And we found, of course, that people with reduced availability of money tended to have lower adherence to the Mediterranean diet. For example, this is not true for UPF, at least in our population. It's not that the less advantaged consume more, because UPF are somehow tended to be consumed by people who spend a lot of time outside home. And these people, for example, are those who have full-time jobs, also qualified jobs, and they do not, back home to have proper meals. For example, are very consumed by people who practice some sport, because all the stuff that we eat just before or after physical activity, like, the protein powders or these bars full of proteins, these are all ultra-processed food. So for ultra-processed food, there is not a gradient in terms of socioeconomic patterning.
In the study in Italy, right? You mentioned.
In Italy, yes. For example, in Italy, but also in Southern Europe. For example, we did not find a pattern, for example, in the sun cohort, which has been conducted in Spain. In US, yes. In US, you have that the lower the socioeconomic status, the highest the UPF consumption. But in Italy, it's not this is not the case, and also in Spain, for example.
I imagine that this is no corroboration of our Ministry of Agriculture statement saying that the poor in Italy often eat better than the rich. I guess this evidence has not shown, right?
In the case of UPF, it could be because the poor tended to consume less UPF, but the poor, of course, adhere less to the Mediterranean diet, because the Mediterranean diet is a plant-based diet prevalently, not exclusively, because there is animal sources food, of course, there is meat, there is cheese, there is egg and fish, so it's not a vegan vegetarian diet. But of course, has lots of vegetables, and vegetables cost a lot. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, they have, an impact in the family budget, especially if you have to cook for 4 people, not just for you. So it's quite expensive. So I would not say that poor people eat better than rich people in this case.
Yes, this is going against our overwhelming amount of evidence, actually. Getting back to your very interesting study, I think you mentioned on your paper that this is actually the first systematic review of observational studies looking at how diet quality has affected COVID outcomes. And looking at the odds ratios that are measures of association or relative risk measure of associations, you show that there are strong effect sizes, especially in terms of hospitalization, but also mortality, and a bit weaker effect size for infections, if I see from. Do you think that there might be some explanation for this differential effects on these 3 outcomes? And if indeed a quality diet affects even infections, which is really an interesting and powerful message if it's confirmed, what biological mechanisms are involved in this association?
Well, in fact, there is a difference between infection. Infection is strongly influenced by a lot of factors, for example, our analysis were controlled for use of masks or the frequency with which people used to go out during pandemic. We have a full assessment of potential covariates. The effect of diet in the infection is more questionable, honestly. In fact, the most important effect is seen against the disease, because the biological plausibility for infection is, a little bit uncertain. Also because, although you control your analysis for confounders, it's very, very difficult. Of course, you have unmeasured confounders, so information that you were not able to collect because, you cannot cover everything when you do an epidemiological study. So, of course, you focus on known risk factors and try to cover all aspects. But also because the biological plausibility for the immune system is more when you are infected. So you are infected, and the way you have eaten before getting infected has some implication in the response that your immune system has to start when it gets infected. And so you can be, you can develop the symptoms or not. That's the point. The point is that you can get infected, but this is not a problem, honestly. I mean, during the pandemic, we've been said that also if you don't have symptoms, you had to stay at home. And this, of course, now we know that some beliefs needs to be revised. But anyway, the problem with everything, also with other infections and other diseases, is the way your immune system reacts once it has been infected. So basically our study, but also the other that we included in the systematic review, provided more strong evidence against the disease rather than the risk of getting infected. But also because when you get infected, your immune system has to put some, defense line to preserve from developing the severe disease. And this is true also for other kind of infection, of course, because everybody is, exposed to infection anyway, also influenza, a normal flu. And there are people who get severe symptoms and other people, who are quite fine. And but also in this case, is also a problem of inflammation. One of the common hallmarks of all infection diseases, but also for chronic disease, because we know that low-grade inflammation in that case, now we have an acute inflammation because you get in contact with the virus, push you to release, an inflammatory response. This is acute inflammation. In the case of chronic disease, you have a low-grade inflammation, which is a little bit different, but the inflammation is a common soil between also infectious and chronic disease as well.
Asking a question that is related to inflammation that you point out as an important mechanism for explaining how these factors affect one another. The World Health Organization, and I'm asking this question from Padova in Veneto, where we have a culture of enjoying wine, and the topic is very important because we want to know more about what can happen when we drink wine or other type of alcohol products. So we have the World Health Organization that delivered a message saying there is no safe amount of alcohol that, based on, I think, a global burden of disease study that although shows that for older people, there are some small amount of consumption of alcohol might be related to different health outcomes. But you mentioned wine, moderate amount of wine. Even in terms of inflammation, you mentioned, I think, you described a moderate amount of wine consumption, even as a reducer of inflammation. However, we have also plenty of evidence showing that wine is also a contributor of inflammation. How would you balance the two?
This is a huge that we can do a specific webinar on alcohol, on the effect of alcohol for health. But anyway, I will try to be, concise. Our group has been involved in the alcohol issues for 30 not 13, 30 years. And we have always believed that moderate alcohol consumption, it's not our belief. I mean, when you talk about Mediterranean diet, you cannot exclude moderate amount of wine. I mean, in the pyramid that I showed you before, if you see, it's not our pyramid, it has been made by some organization, international organization that deal with the Mediterranean diet. They put alcohol in moderation. Alcohol, we mean wine, but we have also evidence on the beneficial effect of beers, because also beer has polyphenols, different type of polyphenols, but polyphenols because it's vegetable drink. And alcohol is a main component of the Mediterranean diet. If you remove alcohol from the Mediterranean diet, this is not anymore the Mediterranean diet. It's something else. It's a good balanced diet, but the Mediterranean diet includes moderate amounts of wine during meals, not like, during aperitif or like binge drinking. So most of the evidence comes from countries where there is no culture of wine. In US, you don't have culture of wine. In the northern area of Europe, you don't have culture of wine. So the way they drink is like binge drinking, that is consuming large amounts of spirits, of ethanol, during 2 weeks, 2 days per week, that is the weekend. And this kind of population, data derived from this kind of population, are used to make guidelines to Mediterranean people. So thanks also to the Molisani study and to the study that are in Spain, in France, because maybe you've been heard about the French paradox, which basically is the opposite of what the WHO says. I mean, in France, they eat wine, they drink wine, they have a very fat diet because they eat a lot of cheese and very fat sources of food, but they drink wine. And if you drink wine while you're having a diet rich in saturated fat, this counterbalance the oxidation that is done by saturated fat. So honestly, I don't know if they have real data to issue this recommendation. We have provided some response also to the Lancet, because the Lancet published in 2022 published a huge study. But when we looked at the supplementary material, they have the main data, and then you have a large number of pages including supplementary data. Basically, we didn't find what they say to have found. The only thing is that you have different effect of alcohol consumption on the cardiovascular outcomes and on cancer outcomes, while the evidence on cardiovascular outcomes, like, heart attack and whatever relates to cardiovascular issues, is clearly reduced by moderate consumption, like 30% reduced risk. For cancer, you don't have this. You have or some kind of protection for certain cancer, or you have null effects. I mean, there is no effect, no bad, no good, or you have a small increased risk, especially for breast cancer, like 5% increased risk for moderate alcohol consumption. So the point is, you have 30% protection for cardiovascular disease, which is still the leading cause of death. And you have a small increase just for one cancer, one type of cancer, which is basically breast cancer. And based on this, you say that there is no safe dose for alcohol consumption. For us, it is unacceptable. In fact, we are involved in several panels of, researchers, and we want to stop this, let's say, terrorism for people, and just recommend that if you are a drinker, you are advised to continue drinking in moderation during meals. Of course, if you are an abstainer, you shouldn't start drinking just because there is some evidence that you can get some benefits against CVD, because abstainers are a particular category of people. And if they abstain from alcohol drinking, that means that they don't have the capability of metabolize alcohol, so they do not have to start drinking. But people who drink, they can keep on drinking in moderation. Moderation means, the concept of moderation is also important. One standard glass of wine, unit in alcohol is measured in a unit, that is one glass for women during meals, and maximum 2 glasses of wine for men, because the metabolism is different for men and women.
We are looking forward to read your reply to the WHO study to get more knowledge about this. Another question that very interesting question, very interesting results coming out of your presentation. You mentioned that we need to take a new look at food. And I think you even refer to the work of a group of scholars led by Carlos Monteiro that really made a huge difference in understanding food items and understanding the health effects of food items. Also because of the level of frustration with the wars on calories and the wars on fat that have not produced those outcomes that we were expecting in terms, for example, of diabetes or obesity. You mentioned ultra-processed products are some of the culprits of these health effects. So we need to look at the level of processing, and you mentioned the NOVA system. And also you mentioned 2 very interesting cases that I can call false friends, the flavor yogurt and this breakfast cereals, right? My question is, if we go to any Italian bookstore, you will find plenty of books and recommendations, suggestions. What do you recommend to do in order to inform ourselves about these false friends, and also to get like readings that are evidence-based, based on solid scientific knowledge? Because we know that there are lots of books that are not based on solid scientific knowledge. What's your take on this?
I've always asked myself and my colleague, we would be the perfect delivery of this research to people, because we study a lot, but at the end, what we want to do, as you want to do, is to have a strong impact on the population. I think that the best way to preserve the health from, a nutritional point of view of people is to tell people that they have to get back to cook. Because if you're back in the kitchen, your chance to have ultra-processed food are very low. And this has been seen in Molisani, in our Italian survey, in every population setting where researchers have analyzed the association between UPF and Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet, just to be, is not a list of food. Mediterranean diet is a culture. And if you have this culture, you cook. Because Mediterranean diet cannot be made by ready-to-eat or ready-to-heat meals, cannot be made by salad, which is packed, wrapped in plastic, cannot be made by, preserved food. Mediterranean diet is made of freshly prepared meals. That means that you have to cook almost every day. This is the traditional Mediterranean diet. Of course, we are in a different time. We are not at the time of Ansel Keys, who is the man who basically discovered, but the Mediterranean diet. We are in a totally different environment. We are busy. Women are no longer in the kitchen. That's the fact. It's not a judgment. So they do not prepare food for the family. Men either. So nobody prepares real food for the family, for himself or herself, depends on the on the family where you live in. So people want to have a proper diet without cooking. It is simply impossible. So the thing that we can say to people is just spare time also during your weekend and prepare your foods for the next week, for the whole next week. So let's back to cook. Instead of going out for aperitif and consuming lots of wine so that the WHO is not happy, stay at home, buy fresh food, prepare. You can preserve, by in freezer, or you can cook. There are many techniques to process food, not ultra processed food, because the Mediterranean diet has processing. The problem is not processing. Everything is processed. Also bread, artisanal bread is processed. Pasta is processed. But the issue is with ultra processing, which has not nutritional. The ultra process is just because they want people to consume more and to consume. They promote overconsumption. People producing ultra processed food, they are not interested in nutritional value. They are interested in promoting overconsumption. The more you consume, the more they earn money. That's the only purpose of this kind of food, which is, very important also in our diet. Not that important, like, as I said, 20% of calories, but in adult population, in children, we have like 30% of calories, because you mentioned flavored yogurts and breakfast cereals and all the sports food, but also baby food. Baby food is mostly ultra processed, all the pre-prepared stuff that you use at 6 months, where the baby needs start having some food. The milk, if you don't breastfeed, you have to use you have to buy the meal, the powder meal. Everything is for children is mostly ultra processed, and this is particularly relevant because these foods. The problem is also, it's not just the nutritional composition that we have already seen that is not that the point. Also because these foods are wrapped in plastic. The plastic has contaminants that migrate to food. And if you are exposed to these substances in your early life, when you are a child or a baby, this could have an impact on development, which is very harmful. Because if you are exposed to plastic at 50 years of age, it's different that you have been exposed since you were like 2 months or 2 years. So that's a huge, there is a great public health concern about UPF. And it's not just because they are high in sugar, because not every ultra-processed food is high in sugar, high in fat. For example, vegetarian and vegan have lots of ultra-processed food. Because if you eliminate, I don't know, fresh meat, fresh fish, fresh milk and dairy products, what you tend to consume alternatives to the meat, and so you consume like, soya, tofu, and all this stuff is ultra processed. If they are put like, in burgers or so on. Nobody cooks soya burger at home. That's the problem. So one simple advice that can be given to people is go back to cook. And also read carefully the labels on foods. If you find that there are more than 5 ingredients, that's more likely to be an ultra-processed food. More than 5 usually is that this is the number that has been set. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally, but we have to do public health, so we have to be more general. We cannot be so specific. Look at the ingredients. More than 5, it's likely that product is ultra-processed.
Very good. That's a very strong and clear message we got here. Look at the ingredients. There are more than 5 items as a rule of thumb, of course.
Yes.
Check what you are eating, right? And also, instead of having ready to eat and ready to heat type of food items that, according to the classification, they are not even called anymore food items. They are ultra processed products, right? They are products, not food items. And focus on freshly made food, getting back a bit to the old style way of life we used to have. Right? Okay, final question, very quick.
Yes.
About policies, about how to prepare for the next pandemic. We talk about pandemic plans. We invested so much resources on vaccination that actually made a huge difference in reducing mortality and hospitalization. We have also the prevention part, but can we also prepare for a next pandemic by improving population health? For example, by having policies that can improve the diet of the entire population, especially people in lower socioeconomic categories that might not afford certain type of food. What's your suggestions? How do we change the world, Marialaura?
I don't know, by with researchers that talk to people directly without intermediation. We meet our participants in the Molisani regularly, let's say twice a year. We go to these people, now they are quite old, and we meet these people and say, first, thank you, because we work because you decided to join us. Then we show these are the data, of course, without too many numbers, but with concept. So they understand that their participation has a value and has been used for, also to move the debate. I won't say the recommendation because, Carlos Monteiro struggles with having the indication of reducing UPF in dietary guidelines. In Brazil, I think they have been the first, maybe because Carlos works there. And of course, this country could be more sensitive. But in Italy, I'm a member of the Italian Society of Nutrition, and I can assure that there is no indication on reducing UPF for people. So what we can do for the next pandemic, and I hope that it's likely that there will be. Let's hope that it's not, stronger because with this stuff of antibiotics resistance is very scaring. But what we can do is what we can do also for chronic disease, because if the pandemic does not come, we have to protect ourselves and reduce ourselves the risk of having cancer, of having CVD. It's a huge problem. But since we cannot reduce our exposure to pollutants, because how can we, if you live in Milan, or you move to, I don't know, Padua, maybe it's better from this side, or you move to a small village in southern Italy, but if you live in Milan, you cannot reduce by your own the exposure to pollutants, to air pollution.
Even though there are policies that can reduce the amount of
the policies, but I'm more interested in what you can do at individual level, because maybe it's more efficacious. You have more chance that this could be efficacy. But anyway, what we can do is the diet, because the diet is something that you do every day, more than once a day. But also do not forget the importance of physical activity. Moderate physical activity doesn't mean that you have to become an athlete. You have just to move, because these two factors interact. And if they interact, means that the effect of one is not just the sum of the effect, but there is a multiplication of effect. And also for the vulnerable people, that's a huge problem. I don't know if it's just a problem. Let's say we have studied a lot about what is the most important factor, is if it's a cultural factor or a financial factor that, for example, contributes to the gradient in the diet quality. Basically, also here, if you have both, I mean, you are low educated and you have low financial resources. This is the worst condition. So for education, you can do more. Also at public health policy, you can do campaign which are targeted for these people with a different kind of language. But for financial stuff, honestly, it's very difficult. You should have, for example, discount in terms of reducing the price of the staple foods. But I don't know, honestly, if it can be done at government level. You should, for example, do a special card dedicated just for grocery. Not that you can buy whatever, but for example, that you can have access to healthy foods by using this card, for example. This could be a way of pushing people, not pushing, maybe because they know what is good for their health, but they cannot afford, especially family with children. It's very, very difficult. And also there is another thing that is not done in Italy, the ban of advertising for children. That is done in, for example, also in South America. And this could be useful because children are exposed heavily to advertising of foods. Of these foods, of course, not of apples and vegetables. So this has been done. There are some studies showing that this could be an effective strategy to reduce at least the consumption of some foods. And there are also the taxi policy, the policies of taxes.
Taxation, yeah, and subsidy.
Nice conflicting results. For example, for tobacco, I don't think that has been useful in Italy. Now pack of cigarettes costs like €7. But I considering the prevalence of smokers, there is not a huge reduction in the last 20 years. So maybe it's not the right way. I believe more in banning the advertising for children, because they are the population group which is at higher risk, for example, for these unbalanced dietary behaviors. But anyway, it's a very complex. But now, compared to the COVID period that we were like blind, we could not see anything. If we had another similar pandemic, we know that there are some, of course, now we have, beside vaccine, we have also therapies that were not available at the moment because they didn't know exactly what was causing all those conditions. Now we know that, for example, some drugs are effective in reducing the chance of having severe disease. But anyway, what we can do is to have a healthy lifestyle as far as we can.
Yeah.
Because this is useful for the next pandemic, but just to have a life without the disease, because we don't have to extend life only. We have to extend the number of years without disease, which is a quite different concept. That's our goal.
Yeah, no, that's thank you so much for the presentation, for these recommendations, especially on diet and what we can do to increase our chances for a healthy living and prevention of chronic diseases. So thank you so much, Marialaura.
Thank you to you and to your students for this nice meeting and discussion.
Yes, thank you. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you again. Bye.